Good morning and welcome to the 29th meeting in 2013 of the Finance Committee of the Scottish Parliament. And could I please just remind everyone present to please turn off any electronic devices, mobile phones, etc. Our first item of business today is Stage 2 consideration of the Landfill Tax Scotland Bill. We are joined by the Cabinet Secretary for Finance, Employment and Sustainable Growth, along with his officials. Members should note that, as officials cannot speak on the record at Stage 2, all questions should be directed to the Cabinet Secretary. And I'd also like to welcome to the committee Bruce Crawford, MSP, and members of the public. Members have copies of the Marshall list of amendments in the groupings, and we will take each amendment on the Marshall list in turn. The question is that sections 1 to 10 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Members have indicated their agreement. I call Amendment 8 in the name of Bruce Crawford in a group of its own. Bruce Crawford to move and speak to the amendment.
Thank you, Convener. In moving Amendment 8, let me explain some of the background. Around 18 months ago, I was contacted by constituents from Blainfield about contaminated land in part of the village that had been built on the site of a former Calico printworks which had closed in about 1898. It was found that the houses, which were built in the late 50s, early 60s, and that's 1950s, 1960s, were situated on land that had been contaminated by both lead and arsenic. And after testing and retesting, 13 properties remain in need of remediation due to the levels of contamination. The residents of Blainfield and Stirling Council, and to be fair to the Council, have come together to work together to find the best possible solution to the matter they face and the many obstacles and challenges they also face. The cost of remediation to Stirling Council, which should be the appropriate authority because there's no other body left who could pay for this, and my constituents is extremely high, partly due to the cost of landfill tax. Initial estimates suggest the cost of the decontamination of the land is likely to be in excess and well over £500,000, of which a large proportion, about £250,000, estimated being the cost of landfill tax. It's a very unusual, if not unique, set of circumstances. They all bought their houses without any knowledge the land was contaminated, and the developer is long out of business. However, they are now facing huge costs which they cannot possibly meet. So my constituents have been working closely with Stirling Council officials over the past 18 months. Stirling Council have agreed to provide £125,000 towards the cost of remediation and are planning to use their in-house contractor to have land decontaminated through a best value process. Unfortunately, the landfill tax element of the projected costs will not all be met with the Council, and therefore leaving a significant burden on 13 householders. Now, I've written to the Westminster Government about the matter and been told it's not feasible to grant exemptions to landfill tax for such specific circumstances under the current legislative framework. I'd also say it's entirely possible that the matter will not be fully resolved until this Parliament takes on responsibility for landfill tax. That's why I feel it necessary, Convener, to bring forward and submit an amendment to the Landfill Tax Scotland Bill. The amendment is in relation to Section 11 of the Landfill Tax Scotland Bill and is designed to allow for exemptions to be given by certificate when the cost falls on persons whom the tax authority considers were not responsible for the land becoming contaminated.
Would the member give way?
Entirely, if that's in order for the
debate. Yes, I thank the member for giving way. I just wonder if that would be a very wide exemption, because if it's we're not responsible for the land becoming contaminated, could really cover, as well as his situation, which I've got sympathy for, a very wide range of people who could claim they didn't know about it.
You must have known, Mr Mason, exactly the point I was about to come to, because I'm about to address the issue of the amendment and its very nature. So I'll deal with that. While this specific amendment would not solve all the problems my constituents are facing, it would provide them with comfort of knowing that it would result in significant reduction in overall costs they are individually facing. However, I do recognise the shortcomings of the specific amendment, as potentially it could open the door to a developer who purchased land and found it to be contaminated and hadn't gone through the proper due diligence process and then sought to find an exemption through a certificate. So I think the point made by Mr Reason is correct. Therefore, it would not it's not my intent, therefore, to ask the committee to look upon this amendment to be of a probing in nature, and ask the government to consider bringing forward their own amendment at stage 3, a specific amendment which would assist my constituents to deal with the unique circumstances at Blainfield and aid them at the same time, and avoid opening the door to any unintended consequences. And at that, I think I'm concluded.
Thank you, Bruce. Jamie?
Thank you, Convener. Can I say at the outset I have a huge amount of sympathy for the people that are affected by this, Bruce, and I actually think I don't know if they contacted all members of the committee, but they certainly contacted me. I remember them contacting me way back. I very much welcome the fact that this is a probing amendment, because I think it may be just worded a little too widely, and I know that Bruce recognises it, so I suppose this is more directed at the government for their further consideration. If any amendment or mechanism is brought forward, I think it will be important that it will be worded in such a way, because I don't think this is worded in the way it should be to meet the intention that the circumstance should be where a person was unaware of the contamination, because I think the way it's worded just now, it talks about responsibility rather than the awareness of the land having been contaminated, and I think that's something that will need to be factored in as well. But I do welcome the fact that Bruce Crawford's brought this amendment forward. I think it's an important issue and one that we need to take on board and consider, Convener.
Thank you. Malcolm?
Perhaps the Cabinet Secretary will address this particular point in his response, but I'm just wondering, looking at the actual Section 11 of the bill, whether in fact the action that Bruce Crawford wishes could in fact already be carried through under Section 11 of the bill. And then I'm presuming that may be the case, and I'm also therefore presuming that there isn't an equivalent section in the UK legislation, but perhaps the Cabinet Secretary can address that in his response. So I'm certainly entirely sympathetic to Bruce Crawford's amendment, but I'm just kind of wondering whether it will make a substantive difference in practice, since both the clause and the amendment are couched in terms of may. I'm presuming Scottish ministers would already have the power under Section 11 to carry out the exemption to waive the tax in the way that Bruce Crawford omits, and that therefore, in a kind of way, the proposed amendment is merely illustrative of one of the circumstances which could lead to the Section 11 power being triggered. But perhaps the Cabinet Secretary will comment on that in his responses. But I'm certainly sympathetic to the intention of the amendment.
Cabinet Secretary?
Convener, can I begin first of all by thanking Mr Crawford for bringing forward this amendment and for the opportunity to consider what's clearly a very important issue for his constituents. Amendment 8 sets out a particular circumstance in which ministers could apply an exemption under the powers in Section 11 of the bill. I quite understand the significance of the issue that's been raised by Mr Crawford, and that the remediation of contaminated land can have serious financial consequences for individual householders. And that is, I think, a key point that I would want to make to the committee, that the amendment as drafted by Mr Crawford, and this is Mr Hepburn's point, is significantly wider than just on the question of individual householders who, I think we all accept, rather inadvertently find themselves in the situations that they are in. So I have great sympathy for the householders of Blainfield who find themselves in a situation not of their own making. I think, however, that from my understanding of the way this issue has been handled and the approach that has been taken by Stirling Council, there is the possibility that this issue may well have to be addressed before this legislation would come into effect, given that I understand Stirling Council may well be moving to invitation to tender, so there may be a requirement for some of this work to be done in a shorter timescale than the legislation coming into effect in April 2015. So the bill before us may not actually provide a practical solution to the issue, the very specific set of circumstances that Mr Crawford raises on behalf of his constituents. However, there will be a general point that is raised about the fact that there will be householders who might inadvertently find themselves in this circumstance in other cases, and obviously the committee has to give consideration as to whether or not making specific provision on the face of the bill would be appropriate in this respect. I think one of the points I would make, and my office have provided this advice to Mr Crawford already, is that I do think under the existing terms of the UK Landfill Communities Fund, there may be an opportunity for some remediation financial support to be available through a grant application by the residents. And I certainly, in the short term, although the legislation within the UK bill doesn't have an explicit provision in this respect, I think there would be the opportunity for a discussion with those who operate the UK Landfill Communities Fund to identify if there was a practical way of seeking some financial support that would enable the householders to make a contribution towards the remediation without that coming from their own resources. And that's an opportunity that I would hope could be pursued. Looking at the specifics of the amendment itself, my first concern is essentially a technical amendment, and this is Mr Chisholm's point, which is absolutely correct. The amendment does not extend the powers in the bill. Such an exemption could already be provided by regulations under the current wording in section 11, so Mr Chisholm is absolutely correct in that respect. My second concern, which is essentially Mr Hepburn's point, which is in relation to the scope of the amendment, it appears that extending the exemption this way would be a way out of tax to anyone who owns contaminated land. It may be that someone has bought land in the knowledge that it was contaminated with the intention of undertaking remedial work to realise the full value of the land. The amendment as drafted appears to relieve them of paying landfill tax in those circumstances, which is something I would not be anxious to provide for. I would propose that supporting land remediation projects ought to be one of the objectives of the Landfill Communities Fund when the Scottish Landfill Tax is introduced in April 2015, which would provide in essentially the practical arrangements for dealing with these questions some support or opportunity for support that could be taken forward by members of the public who found themselves in the situation that Mr Crawford's constituents found themselves in. Further thought will be needed to set out the details of this in regulations in due course. In making those remarks to the committee convener, I hope that that's provided some assurance about the direction that the government's thinking would be operating in this way, and I'd be happy to provide whatever assistance I can to Mr Crawford in the short term to try to ensure that the Landfill Communities Fund is able to engage constructively with him on this question.
Thank you. Bruce Crawford to wind up and press or withdraw his amendment.
Thank you, Convener. A number of interesting points made. I want to go back over the ground that Mr Mason and Mr Hepburn already alluded to. I think that the points he made were germane and correct. And Malcolm Chisholm obviously raised a particular issue about whether the regulations as currently drafted in the bill could apply here. I think I shall seek to discover from the Cabinet Secretary later about whether these regulations could be fashioned in such a way to deal with the particular and unique circumstances in Blainfield, and in that way give some assurance for the future, because I don't think it's entirely certain that Stirling Council will necessarily prosecute this process to the degree that will enable this all to be completed by 2015. They're being very canny and very sensible about the way they're going about it, and recognise that if they were to proceed at the moment, there is no way that the householders could possibly find the resource. On the point of resource, I was very grateful for the contact from the Cabinet Secretary's office last week about the Communities Fund. I met with the Communities Fund people yesterday. Because of the way the Communities Fund is structured in Scotland, there will be a limited opportunity, unfortunately, for the Stirling area to receive much of the resource, because it's much defined by the activity of a landfill operating in a particular area, and is usually finds that any resource that comes from that particular landfill site is being identified for that community. So it's not clear that the Communities Fund criteria are wide enough to allow this particular situation through the door. However, I will very much welcome the Cabinet Secretary's commitment to work with me to see if there is a way through that. In recognising the wide-ranging nature of my amendment, I seek to withdraw that But obviously, in the circumstances where I find myself, I might have to consider bringing forward another more tightly drawn amendment at stage 3 if required.
Okay, our colleagues agreed that this amendment should be withdrawn?
Yes.
Members have indicated their agreement. The question, therefore, is that Section 11 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Members have indicated their agreement. The question is that Sections 12 to 19 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
Members have indicated their agreement. I call Amendment 9 in the name of Michael McMahon and a group of its own. Michael McMahon to move and speak to the amendment.
Thanks very much, Convener. I move this amendment because in evidence that we received to the committee on the consultation, it became apparent that whether there was an intention to create this impression or not, there was a suggestion from some of the people who gave evidence that we should look to the Landfill Communities Fund to provide resources for environmental projects out with the areas affected by the landfill sites. Now, that immediately rang alarm bells with me. There was another argument put, which I completely understand and have no difficulty with, which is that the 10-mile radius, which the criteria sets down, in some cases can be too restrictive. That in rural areas there may be a settled community which is impacted in exactly the same way as a community immediately adjacent to a landfill site in terms of air pollution, noise or smell as lorries go through those communities, but the landfill site may be actually more than 10 miles away. So I'm not looking to try and restrict the use of Landfill Communities Fund to communities out with the 10-mile radius, that there is a clear impact on those communities. What this is aiming to do is to challenge the thought processes which appear to come through in the evidence that money could be taken from the Landfill Communities Fund to fund projects which would be beneficial to areas where there can be no connection made in terms of direct impact of the landfill site, and that concerned me, and that's why I brought forward this amendment, because having spoken to people about what the implications of such a change in the use of the Landfill Communities Fund would mean, I could only see it being detrimental to those communities which are actually directly impacted, because it is a diminishing, by its very nature, it is a diminishing fund. So the actual amount that will become available over time will reduce, but the long-term impact of a landfill site in a community will go on for a lot longer than the actual use of the landfill site as a practical facility. So if the money is going to be reduced over time, but the impact is going to remain over time, further reducing that in order to provide funds for projects which have got no connection to the landfill site is a concern for me, and that's the reason why I wanted to have this amendment. To... Yeah.
I just wondered if he was drawing to conclusion. The word vicinity was the one that jumped out at me. Could you define vicinity?
Well, again, as I said, it's not about the actual vicinity in terms of the impact. It's about the vicinity in terms of no impact. You know, there were concerns in the debate that we had on this at stage 1 that there are communities which are out with the 10-mile radius or the vicinity, but have an impact as lorries travel through it as they head, as I said, especially in rural areas. So I totally understand why people would not want to have a restriction on the criteria. What I want is a restriction on the use of the funds where there can be no direct connection between the area that is benefiting from the spend of the money and it being in the vicinity of the landfill site itself. This is the wording that that was suggested to me by the legal advisors on the drafting of amendments. So there were two options put before me. One was very complex. This was the most simplistic one. It seemed to be the most logical one, to be fair, and I'm sure that those who have got more knowledge of these drafting issues will be able to explain why there were two potential ones, one more complex than the other. I wanted one which would do the most basic thing to a very simple set of criteria which surrounds the Landfill Communities Fund.
Thank you, Gavin. To be followed by John.
Thank you, Convener. I agree entirely with the principle which Mr McMahon puts forward today, but is also put forward during the various committee stages and the Stage 1 debate. And I think it's a principle to which the committee in many respects signed up to in our report overall. My concern with this particular amendment, I think, has been fleshed out partly by John Mason in his intervention. It is the word vicinity. I think on a strict dictionary definition, which uses the word surrounding, I think that's a pretty narrow definition. I think it would be quite restrictive, and I think it would probably tighten up far more than Mr McMahon intends to, at least in the terms of what he said. I think if the word vicinity is used and this amendment passes and goes directly into the face of the bill, I think it would then be much more difficult to define exactly what it is that we as a committee, we as a parliament want in terms of the distinction between rural and urban under the 10-mile rule. I think the principle is right. I just think if we pass this particular amendment, particularly on the use of the word vicinity, I think it would become unduly restrictive, and I think we may have problems then fleshing out exactly what it is that we intend to achieve.
Okay, John, to be followed by Jean.
Thank you, Convener. I think just slightly to expand on my point, and again the question of vicinity, which has been mentioned both by Mr McMahon and Mr Brown, because I think the assumption has been made sometimes that 10 miles might be too little and we need to look at a wider area, whereas I would suggest in the city 10 miles might be too broad. I have a landfill site in my constituency, and I think all parts of Glasgow would probably be within 10 miles of it, but on Mr McMahon's argument, which I agree with, places on the far side of Glasgow are in no way disadvantaged by that landfill site. And so I do like the idea that the benefit should primarily be to those who are most severely affected. I have to say I'm not entirely convinced by the amendment, but I would hope that the regulations would reflect some of the debate we had at the committee earlier on as to how we get that balance, and it shouldn't just be a fixed distance. Thank you.
Jean.
Well, I too have sympathy with the amendment initially, and given, I suppose, historically what we've done with our rubbish. But it seems to me that, you know, times are changing, and the landfill sites, many of them closing down, are being finished and treated. And the whole idea of the future is that we won't be taking stuff to landfill. So it occurs to me that as the lorries, instead of trundling to landfill, are trundling to perhaps the recycling depot and other areas, we need a different way of thinking. And if the money is for environmental projects related to the industry of recycling, it would be a great shame, particularly in the area that I represent, to have a 10-mile radius. That would be a kind of nonsense. But I think we should be looking much wider at this, and I do think that in a year or two we would want to see this quite differently. So I wouldn't want to support the amendment.
Thank you. Cabinet Secretary.
Convener, Mr McMahon has set out in Amendment 9 the purpose of inserting a condition that money from the tax credit scheme or landfill communities fund should be spent within the vicinity of a landfill site, a point which was advanced in the Stage 1 debate. In addressing this amendment, Convener, I'd like to highlight, I think, the issues that are under debate on this question. The presence of a landfill site has essentially two main effects. The first is the disamenity that a landfill site causes to community in its vicinity, and the second is the detrimental effect that the site has on the wider environment. And I think we, in trying to debate and consider these issues, I think the first of these disamenities is absolutely crystal clear, the disamenity on the immediate surrounding community. The detrimental effect that the site has on the wider environment is a more difficult point to define, because Mr McMahon has highlighted the fact that lorries will travel through communities to reach the landfill site, and there may be a disamenity there. There may be disamenity created by the emissions that will emerge from a landfill site, which may have a wider impact on the environment over a larger geography. And I think it's these questions that we are searching for a conclusion on, and I think the debate on those questions has informed a lot of the evidence that has come to the committee and which has clearly caused concern to Mr McMahon. So I've some sympathy with the position that Mr McMahon's expressed to the committee on this point. As I indicated in my response to the Finance Committee Stage 1 report, I agree with the principle that those communities most affected by a landfill should benefit from the money available through the fund. The fund that will be established as an integral part of the tax under Sections 18 and 20 of the Bill will, I'm sure, be of significant benefit to the communities in the vicinity of a landfill site, but should not be available to communities further afield which suffer no disimmunity from having a landfill site nearby. But the question that arises out of that is the consideration as to what extent the fund should apply to reflect the impact that landfill sites have on the wider environment. We've already considered the potential for the fund to support land remediation projects such as the one in Blainfield that Mr Crawford has brought to the committee's attention, and the fund has the potential to support other environmental and other types of projects. In the consultation process prior to the introduction of the bill, a majority of respondees supported the view that funding for environmental and biodiversity projects should be available through Scottish Landfill Tax Communities Fund on the basis that landfill sites contribute to climate change and are responsible for a sizable element of Scotland's greenhouse gas emissions. And I think it's this issue that we need to consider and come to a conclusion about in the terminology that's put in place around this scheme, which I think is a matter of course I would prefer to see in regulation rather than on the face of the bill, because I think as the exchange between Mr Mason and Mr McMahon highlighted, and I have every sympathy with Mr McMahon on the question of trying to pin this point down, and I have no criticism of the ability to get this to a fine point. It is, in coming down to a point on vicinity, vicinity for me, and I would argue vicinity, is really quite a tight term around a site, which may actually not actually serve the purposes that we're all trying to agree upon. During the course of the Stage 1 debate on the bill, I indicated that I'd be happy to discuss the approach to this issue with Mr McMahon, and I'd welcome the opportunity to hold that discussion, and I'd be very happy to do that informally with other members of the committee if that would help. And to do that before Stage 3 of the bill, to provide colleagues with the opportunity to reflect on the issues that are at stake here. I think I don't think there's no disagreement about the fact that communities that suffer a disamenity from a landfill site should have access to the fund. That is absolutely agreed. I think the question is, if we're going beyond that impact and that disamenity, how far are we going and on what basis are we going? And I'm mindful of the predominant consultation response that was arguing for a position which I think is appears to me to be slightly broader than the position that Mr McMahon is arguing at committee today, and I'd be anxious to consider that evidence in dialogue with members in advance of Stage 3 so that we could either come to an agreement about what's the best way forward, or alternatively leave space for members to be able to exercise their proper and due right to advance their interests and their issues at Stage 3 in the final stage of the bill. So I'd be happy to facilitate those discussions and to do those timeously before Stage 3 of the bill.
Thank you. Michael McMahon to wind up and either press or withdraw his amendment.
Thanks very much, Convener. I do very much welcome the comments made by the Cabinet Secretary. For clarity, what I'm trying to seek here is a direct link between the impact of the landfill site and the community that may benefit from funding from the Landfill Communities Fund. I get the general point about them contributing to climate change, but then everything appears to contribute to climate change, and where do we stop with that? These are communities that are directly impacted, called disamenity in the terminology, obviously. But for some communities, there is no disamenity in terms of the direct linkage between the landfill site and that local community. But I very much welcome the contribution from the Cabinet Secretary this morning, and would welcome the opportunity to discuss this further with him. And on that basis, I hope not to press the the amendment at this time.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Committee members agreed to withdraw the amendment? Yes. Members are agreed. The question is that section 20 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Members have indicated the agreement. The question is that sections 21 to 40 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Members have indicated the agreement. I call Amendment 1 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, grouped with Amendments 2 to 7. Cabinet Secretary to move Amendment 1 and speak to all amendments in the group.
Convener, Amendments 1 to 7 deal with setting out which procedures should apply to certain order-making powers. This is in response to recommendations from both this committee and the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee following the Stage 1 process. Amendments 1, 3 and 7 relate to Section 17, dealing with the liability of controllers. This change is following a recommendation from the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee Stage 1 report, which identified that changes to this section could increase the scope of the tax. This amendment therefore will make regulations under Section 17, which would change the liability of landfill site controllers subject to the affirmative procedure. Amendment 2, 4 and 6 relate to Section 11, which deals with the power to vary what is a taxable disposal. I note the Finance Committee's recommendation that this be subject to affirmative procedure. Creating an exemption may prove suitably controversial to merit further scrutiny. Therefore, these amendments make all orders under Section 11 subject to the affirmative procedure. Amendment 5 relates to Section 13.4, setting additional rates of tax. It makes all orders under Section 13.4 subject to provisional affirmative. I note the Finance Committee's recommendation that this should be subject to affirmative procedure. However, to stop contractors and operators taking advantage of any change and perhaps rushing to landfill materials, we have amended this to be to the provisional affirmative procedure in order that any change takes immediate effect. I would move Amendment 1, Convener.
Okay, thank you. There are no comments from members of the committee. Cabinet Secretary, have you anything further to add? Okay, the question is that Amendment 1 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Members are agreed. I call Amendments 2 to 7, all in the name of the Cabinet Secretary and all previously debated, and invite the Cabinet Secretary to move Amendments 2 to 7 en bloc.
Moved en bloc, Convener.
Do any committee members have an objection to them being moved en bloc? There is no objection. The question, therefore, is that Amendments 2 to 7 are agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Members have indicated their agreement. The question is that Section 41 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are. The question is that Sections 42 to 44 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are. The question is that the long title be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are. Committee members, Cabinet Secretary, that ends Stage 2 consideration of the bill. Members should note that the bill will now be reprinted as amended and will be available tomorrow morning. The Parliament has not yet determined when Stage 3 will take place, but members may now lodge Stage 3 amendments with the legislation team. Members will be informed of the deadline for amendments once it has been determined. I'd like to thank the Cabinet Secretary for his attendance today, and I'd like to call a brief recess in order for the Cabinet Secretary and his officials to leave, and suspending in order to also allow a changeover of witnesses. Okay, 5-minute break. Restart the session. Our second item of business is to take evidence from the Scottish Government Bill team as part of our scrutiny of the Criminal Justice Scotland Bill's financial memorandum. I therefore welcome to the meeting Elspeth MacDonald, Peter Hope-Jones and Kerry Twyman. And I understand that a member of the Bill team would like to make a brief opening statement.
Yes, thank you, Convener. If I may do that now, the Criminal Justice Bill is a wide-ranging and forward-thinking reform which will modernise and strengthen the criminal justice system. Most of its provisions have been developed from the recommendations of two independent reviews, Lord Carloway's review of criminal law and practice and Sheriff Principal Bowen's review of sheriff and jury procedure. Lord Carloway's review was prompted by the Cadder case, which had a significant and immediate effect on the criminal justice system, resulting in the abandonment of hundreds of prosecutions, some of them for very serious crimes. The provisions of the bill which implement Lord Carloway's review are intended to create a criminal justice system that is able to meet the requirements of modern society and provide as much resilience as possible against any unexpected future developments in European Court of Human Rights jurisprudence. The costs associated with the bill are, of course, set out in the financial memorandum. The Cabinet Secretary for Justice and the Cabinet Secretary for Finance and Employment and Sustainable Growth have made it clear that these costs are reasonable in the context of the reforms that will put Scotland at the forefront of human rights protections and will introduce efficiencies to the criminal justice system. The memorandum has developed through close consultation and discussion with key partners, including Police Scotland, Crown Office, Scottish Prison Service, Scottish Court Service, Scottish Legal Aid Board, COSLA and the Association of Directors of Social Workers. The costs are based on the information provided by those various bodies, including the shadow marking exercise, and on the professional experience and judgment of the various bodies involved in their preparation. What we have put forward, therefore, is what we consider to be the best possible estimate of the costs associated with the bill as introduced. I can give some slightly more detail on how we went through that process if the committee would find it useful, but that may come out in questioning.
Okay, I'd be quite happy to see if it comes out in questioning. Who knows, I might even ask something along those lines myself, actually. But we'll start off with a few questions from myself, as is normally the case, and then I'll open out the session to colleagues around the table. And the first question I want to ask is in regard to evidence from the Faculty of Advocates, who said, and I quote, "In characterising the additional costs to the court service as opportunity costs, the financial memorandum relies on savings in court time which is anticipated will be achieved by the Bowen proposals. Since these proposals relate to solemn cases prosecuted in the Sheriff Court, it is difficult to see how they could be relevant in the High Court." I just wonder if you can comment on that, please.
Yeah, the faculty is correct to point out that the specific savings identified in the sections on sheriff and jury reforms will impact on the sheriff and jury courts. However, we've developed these estimates in close co-working with the Scottish Court Service, and they have indicated to us that they are able to accommodate these within existing resources, and that's also indicated in the written submission to this committee.
Okay, now, you'll have seen some of the responses that we've received from local authorities in terms of the estimates of the provisions and the recurring costs to local authorities. Western and Bartonshire say, and I quote, "The figures appear to be the result of a series of informed guesses and the assumption that it would result in opportunity costs." And what they go on to say is that this appears to have been arrived at on the basis of no evidence whatsoever.
The first thing to say with regard to the responses that came in from local authorities is that the estimates in the financial memorandum were developed through consultation, as we've already said, with COSLA and ADSW, and we reached agreements with those bodies as representatives of local authorities more widely. We didn't talk individually with local authorities. So it's understandable that a small number of local authorities might not completely hold the same views, and it's worth noting as well that the responses that came into this committee from local authorities are also not unanimous in the position that they're putting forwards on this. We certainly did go through quite a detailed process in terms of estimating impacts on local authorities. There's two major ones to look at there. One is from corroboration, where there was a detailed exercise on the back of the shadow marking exercise, which I can talk about more if people are interested in that. The second was around the sheriff and jury proposals, and again, there was an analytical exercise undertaken by us based on existing models for predicting impacts, and I can provide more details on that if that would be helpful.
Yes, because some of the local authorities are quite critical, saying that you know, that there wasn't really any consideration of the allocation of staff time to accommodate new work arising. And sticking with Western Bartonshire, they said that potential increase for community payback orders is also likely to increase demand on criminal justice staff with no financial contribution provided. I'm concerned that you know, that some of these local authorities feel that their concerns haven't really been addressed at all. You know, I understand what you're saying about COSLA's umbrella organisation, but they seem to feel as if their direct concerns haven't been considered.
These concerns that have come out were not raised with us during the course of producing the financial memorandum, and we did discuss these impacts, as I've already said. So we would stand by the estimates put forward there as part of the opportunity costs that have been presented more generally, I think.
Yes, it's I suppose the difference is we dealt with COSLA and the Association of Directors of Social Workers, and calculated the costs on a Scottish-wide basis. Now, we didn't see that there was, or the information we have strongly suggests that there will be no great impact on any particular local authority, and therefore it cannot be absorbed within current allocations of staff. If that were not to be the case, then we would want to know that, but it is the best information we have. And I do think some of the submissions by the local authorities assume that certain things will happen in the bill that are not necessarily provided for in the bill and are not intended to be provided for in the bill either. It would only, can I elaborate on that one in writing? It's just something I've come across. I certainly will.
Thank you very much for that, because you know, you talked about the social work directors being consulted, but Dundee City Council say that no consideration has been given to the potential increased volume of social work reports as a result of an increase in the number of prosecutions and associated requests for social work court reports. So I'm kind of confused as to if the social work directors were consulted, why the council seems to think that there was no consideration given in terms of this specific local authority, at least.
I could say somewhat unhelpfully, I'm also confused because we did consult in good faith, if you know what I mean.
Right.
But we do understand the position to be as we set it out. It's quite robustly set out in the financial memorandum, and we understand what we are saying to be correct. They haven't caused us to, in their submissions, to move from what has been said already.
Yeah, I mean, in the financial memorandum, we've really tried to drill down quite deeply the impacts in terms of the corroboration changes, and there is quite a lot of detail set out there, but this particular one about social work reports is not one that was raised with us at the time, and so it's not reflected in there.
Okay, now, I was going to ask you another question there, but just before I do, opportunity costs have already been raised, and you have got an explanation of what opportunity costs is in the paper, but I wonder if you can talk us through that a wee bit, just for the public record and for the, because, you know, so that everybody knows what we're talking about.
Yes. The financial memorandum differentiates between financial costs and opportunity costs, and we have we consider opportunity costs as the impacts on staff time and other existing resources which can be managed through measures such as prioritisation of functions and increased operational efficiency. That approach was agreed with our key partners as we move forward. I mean, we have discussed with all the bodies we've mentioned in detail and over some time. Where a specific need has been identified for additional staff in order to meet the needs of the bill, that has been included as financial cost. Where a new process has been identified or an increase in volumes of cases predicted, and the impact of this has been spread throughout Scotland in such a way that it is manageable within existing resources, that has been classified as an opportunity cost, and that's the approach we took with local authorities. There may be some savings, but an example of opportunity costs would be around training. Initially, Police Scotland anticipated a substantial requirement for backfilling of posts and overtime payments in order to achieve implementation of the bill in 2014. Notably, the Commonwealth Games and other major events would have been a real drain on their resources. We responded to these concerns and have set out a timetable for implementation, which allows the training to be completed without the need for widespread backfilling and overtime payments, but by working into staff schedules and cover arrangements so that the staff costs associated with the training can be considered opportunity cost rather than a financial cost. It's around reorganising your business to absorb the changes. Now, a lot of what's in the bill will be business as usual for many of the bodies. Court cases are business as usual for the courts. Investigating crime is business as usual for the police. But there are new ways of doing that business that will need to be trained up for, and then that will become business as usual as well. We also need to not lose sight of the fact that the new processes being introduced aren't being layered on top of old processes. They're replacing what is there already, so that the new process for arrest and detention replaces what is there already. And the new process for looking after suspects of crime is actually different, but the police do that as a matter of course now. And that, I suspect, is a more cogent explanation of opportunity cost. It is what we expect to be done in the normal course of business as usual, even though what we are looking at is a significant change management exercise. But organisations throughout Scotland should be able to deal with that, and that is the way we have looked at it. And that is, in fact, also the way our key partners have accepted it.
Okay, just one area I'm going to touch on before I open the colleagues out, the session out to colleagues around the table, and that's regarding vulnerable adult and child suspects. You know, when the police assess an individual as being vulnerable, the bill requires them to secure the attendance of an appropriate adult as soon as reasonably practical, and the financial memorandum states that this will not entail additional costs as appropriate adult services are provided at present on a non-statutory basis. But again, local authorities are questioning this assumption. Aberdeenshire Council have said that social workers undertake this role on a voluntary basis and that training costs are £5,000 per volunteer. And if this provision becomes statutory, it would mean they would have to be available 24 hours a day, and there would obviously be costs which have not been considered in terms of backfilling. Just wonder if you can talk us through that aspect of the FM, please?
That's actually the example I was thinking of, where a local authority is making an assumption that something will become statutory that isn't. We have no intention of making statutory. If the Parliament makes it statutory, then we would have to reconsider it. But the bill as introduced did not make a statutory requirement for appropriate adults to be provided on a statutory basis, and therefore it's not included in the costings of the bill.
But and you're saying there's no inevitability that will actually take place, or likelihood it will take place?
Well, it's certainly not the government's policy that it should take place, but the bill is obviously now in the hands of the Parliament.
Okay.
Sorry, if I could just add to that. I think at the core of those estimates on vulnerable adults is an agreement with COSLA that the actual practice around providing appropriate adults will not change as a result of the bill. That it will continue to be offered in the way that it is now, and therefore the costs would be the same. We've also agreed with COSLA that we'll monitor quite carefully how this is actually implemented in process and continue to liaise with them on this and react if there are in fact changes.
Okay. Thank you very much for that. I'm now going to open up to colleagues around the table. First person to ask questions will be Deputy Convener, followed by Jamie.
Thanks, Convener. Yes, I mean, the Convener already raised the question of opportunity cost, and it was just to really ask a bit more about that. I mean, from what I understood from your explanation to the Convener, you're suggesting that opportunity cost is because something is going to stop and then something else is going to start. So the amount of work just kind of carries on. But, I mean, my understanding, for example, was that hopefully through this legislation there would be more rape convictions. So does that mean there will actually be more people going through the courts and more people in prison?
The stop and start is part of the explanation. The rest is that we expect this to become business as usual. So we do expect the police and the courts to be able to deal with the business that arises out of these changes by and large as normal. We've identified where, in fact, there are additional costs that we need to provide extra funding for. Yeah, sorry.
I mean, I was just going to say then, well, business as usual, as I understand it, is that the less serious cases never go to court because the courts are so full. And therefore, if you bring in more rape cases, would that just mean that other cases would fall out of the system?
Sorry, I didn't agree with your original proposition that
right.
the less serious cases would not proceed.
Would you agree that that's what happens at the moment?
Well, that's what I'm saying. I don't agree that that's what... I mean, it's not my position to agree that that's what happens at the moment. It's not my understanding of that being what happens at the moment. But we would expect the most serious cases to proceed. But we are talking about increased volumes that are in the serious end of the cases, between 1% and 6%. Is that correct? It's not an overwhelming amount of additional casework. It's not an overwhelming amount of additional work that is expected as a result of this. And that has been confirmed by the Crown Office in its evidence.
So specifically on the prison service, I saw that it stated, I think it's page 70192, Financial Memorandum, in the short term SPS considers it can accommodate the current forecast population within its existing capacity and existing budget. So is there spare capacity in the prisons at the moment?
Yes, SPS has indicated to us that there is currently capacity within the prison system to accommodate the kind of increase that we've indicated in the short term. The Scottish Prison Service and the Scottish Government obviously undertake regular prison population projections and plan the estate provision on that basis. And so we will continue to do so in order to monitor the actual impact of the bill.
Because I'd understood that at least some prisons were overcrowded at the moment and had more than their expected capacity. Is that not the case? In which case they couldn't have spare capacity.
I think it would be for the Scottish Prison Service to comment on this in detail, but my understanding is that there are complexities around this where it's not a simple matter of counting up the number of empty cells in Scotland. They do analysis on what is manageable. They're also a reactive organisation. They don't set the number of people in prisons. That's done by judges. So part of their job is to cope with changes in demand for prisons. So they've assured us that this is manageable in the short term.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder also, has it been taken into account? I mean, presumably the idea, if you take specifically rape, that because more people are convicted, it should actually reduce the crime rate over time, and therefore there should actually be a saving over time. Has that been built in, or is that too long term?
That's not been reflected directly. It's something that we discussed and obviously would be a policy objective of this, but it's very hard to quantify in terms of specific impact in individual years.
Okay.
Yes, the period of the financial memorandum, I think, is definitely too short to take account of that kind of effect, although it is one of the, as Peter says, one of the objectives we're aiming for.
I mean, it has also been suggested, if I've read the media correctly, that some people have questioned whether there will actually be more convictions because there are other hoops to go through instead of corroboration, like, I think, a stricter jury numbers. I mean, so, I mean, one school of thought is that there'll actually be less convictions and therefore there'll be savings. Is there a kind of risk analysis or probability around all of that?
In terms of using conviction rates in the calculations that we've done in the financial memorandum, we've used the existing conviction rates simply because that's the best evidence that we have available. We have worked into it other factors. For example, for Lord Carloway's review, he did some analysis of the types of crimes that would be going forward, and we built that into the model of the additional cases going in. There are arguments that could be made about the impact on the actual conviction rate, some arguing that it might be lower, some arguing it might be higher. For the purpose of these calculations, we've gone with the figure that we have currently because we felt anything else would be sort of speculation. Trying to add a certain percentage to that or decrease a certain percentage wouldn't be particularly constructive.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Jamie, to be followed by Gavin.
Thank you. Convener, I want to turn to the evidence faculty of advocates that have laid out. They set out that the financial memorandum did not provide sufficient information on the shadow exercises that were undertaken to allow for meaningful comment. I wonder how you'd respond to that suggestion.
The shadow marking exercise was set up by Crown Office and Police, so it would be for them to answer on the detail of exactly what they underwent. But it should be noted that the Crown Office has provided supplementary written evidence to this committee, which does provide more detail of what exactly went into that. And they've also since, in evidence to the Justice Committee, set out the new prosecution test, which reflects broadly what was done in the shadow marking exercise as well.
So you would refute the suggestion that there's not enough information about these exercises?
In the financial memorandum as published, there is not a huge amount of evidence of detail. That's a reasonable point, but I think that what Crown Office has put out since gives a decent picture of what was actually undertaken.
The information's there, okay. The faculty also stated that they felt the predicted increase in the numbers of prosecutions was surprisingly small. I suppose the inference being that this might underestimate the cost of prosecuting cases through the courts, although I did note that the Crown Office Prosecutor Fiscal Services set out that it was content that the estimated costs and savings set out in the financial memorandum as they apply to them are reasonable and are as accurate as possible. But how would you respond to the suggestion of the faculty advocates that the predicted increase in the number of prosecutions was surprisingly small?
I did notice that in the faculty submission. The first thing I would point out is that the faculty also stated that they felt overall the financial memorandum was a reasonable summary of costs. And secondly, that they don't give much evidence for why they feel that way. The estimates for corroboration in the financial memorandum were as the result of these detailed shadow marking exercises, which actually reproduced the process of decision-making in actual cases. So it was quite a robust way of evidencing these estimates. So we feel that the estimates are strong and reliable.
Okay.
Sorry,
No, of course.
Convener, it might be useful at this point for me to provide the detail I referred to earlier on the process that we went through in reaching what we have in the financial memorandum. We undertook detailed discussions with our partners about the implications of the bill for their services. This included looking at what would happen if impacts are at higher end ranges and higher end of ranges and the likelihood of that happening. Our financial estimates are in most instances a range of possible outcomes within which we have indicated a best estimate. Where we have used a range, it's because it is best statistical practice to do so. We have then based best estimates, unless we've specifically indicated our own workings on the point, on the professional experience and judgment of the various bodies involved. We do consider, and we've used that methodology across the various bodies we've referred to. We therefore consider the result has been a thorough consideration of the implications of the bill, including the need for training and changes in processes and methodology. I'm sorry, that's nerves. It is informing our planned timetable for implementation, and a full implementation is being prepared once the final terms plan is being prepared once the final terms of the bill are known. So I hope that provides some sort of a background to the actual process, which has been, I have to say, pretty robust and taken some time.
Okay, that's helpful from my perspective anyway, Convener. The faculty also referred to the, and this is an issue that was picked up by the Deputy Convener, the faculty suggested that the incidence of convictions may change as a result of the provisions of this bill, and they suggest that an assessment which simply applies the existing proportion of cases prosecuted under the current arrangements in which a conviction is secured to the additional cases prosecuted could underestimate the costs to the Scottish Prison Service and local authorities. How would you respond to that?
I think this is an illustration of exactly what I was talking about earlier. The faculty submission argues that the conviction rate may actually be higher, and that would impact on the number of convictions and therefore impact on prisons. But as we were hearing earlier, there is an argument that it might in fact be lower because you're removing a bar to certain cases going forward. And increasing the number potentially of cases. So we felt that there was no sufficiently robust evidence either way to give an actual figure for calculations, and that's why we used the existing figure.
Yeah, I can imagine it's pretty difficult to know what the conviction rate may be in future, so I appreciate that. And the Deputy Convener also referred to the Scottish Prison Service position in response to the financial memorandum. Just for absolute clarity, they're not expressing any concerns then about capacity issues at prisons and costs involved around this bill. That's not something that's been presented to you.
I think there are wider conversations about prison capacity, and certainly prison number projections anticipate a certain increase, I think about 200 places per year, broadly anyway. I mean, that doesn't specifically incorporate the predictions in this financial memorandum, but it does reflect an expectation that there will be legal changes, and those changes are liable to be more towards stronger prison sentences rather than less. It's also worth noting that we should consider these increases in prison numbers in the wider context of things like community payback orders as a more robust and flexible community sentence, also the presumption against imposing short prison sentences of 3 months or less, and a range of policy initiatives designed to reduce reoffending, such as the Reduce Reoffending Change Fund. So I mean, there is a wider picture about prison numbers, obviously, and this feeds into that wider conversation.
Okay, I suppose the question, and that is useful, but I suppose the question is, the Scottish Prison Service aren't you're not saying that they are. They're not knocking the government's door down, saying there is a financial problem as a result of this bill.
Not as a result of this bill. They've said that in the short term, the estimates set out in the financial memorandum are manageable within capacity.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Convener. The average cost of a community sentence is £2,400, is that correct?
I believe that's what we use in our calculations. Yes, I would have to check to be sure. It is set out in the financial memorandum. Sorry, what was the actual question? I can confirm.
Yeah, the average cost of a community sentence is £2,400. Is that correct?
What is the question?
We've used a figure of 225,000.
Sorry?
We've used a figure of £225,000
Per community sentence?
for a community. Oh no, sorry, that's a secure accommodation place for 16 and 17-year-olds. Yeah, if that's all right, can we write back on that?
All right. Let's assume it's of that magnitude then. You're assuming that there will be an increase in the number of community sentences. You appear to have a low estimate of 120, a best estimate of 480, and a high estimate of 1,140. So if we work on your best estimate of 480 additional community sentences per year, how do you assume that there will be no additional costs on local authorities with that number of additional cases?
The costs associated with community sentences are different from those associated with prisons and this kind of thing, in that they're mostly about staff time involved in supervising and undertaking those sentences. It's worth noting that the 480 additional places modelled in the financial memorandum is a relatively small percentage increase. It's about 2.8% of the total figure of 16,916. So this has been set out as part of the opportunity costs model that we've already explained in some detail, in that they are manageable in terms of repositioning workloads for social work and other relevant agencies.
Okay. Yeah. So what percentage increase in community sentences would there need to be for there to be an additional cost on local authorities?
I'm not sure I can answer that specifically, but it should also be noted that, quite aside from this bill, there is increasing emphasis on community sentences in the justice system. So not only is our percentage increase
I think it's probably something, I mean, we haven't done the calculations to hand. I mean, I think when we're talking about the staff time, what we're talking about here is you would need to have a big enough increase to actually mean that current staff couldn't absorb it. So if we were talking about something that was an extra couple of hours a week, I think there would be an expectation that current staff could absorb it. If we were talking something that was large enough that would actually require going out and recruiting additional staff, then there would be a financial cost. And I think in the discussions that were had with COSLA and around this area, it wasn't seen that there would be a high enough impact based on these numbers to actually require going out and recruiting additional members of staff.
Okay, so but my question then is, what percentage increase do you need before new staff are required? I mean, you're saying you've not done those calculations.
I think in the discussions that were had, the feeling was that it wasn't anywhere near enough. When you looked at even between at the high end of the range, divided across all the various authorities in Scotland, it didn't come out high enough to absolutely need to go and recruit additional staff. There was the feeling that it could be managed within current staff.
Okay, just that the evidence presented to this committee, the convener mentioned Western Bartonshire Council, who said there would be additional costs. Falkirk Council have said to us there will be increased staffing costs. Fife Council question your assumptions. Renfrewshire Council say it will be very difficult to absorb the costs. So we're getting a message from local authorities that there would be an increased costs. You're saying there wouldn't. So I'm trying to work out what is the, what percentage are there clearly going to be increased costs. We're getting a very different message, obviously, from what you're presenting to us.
I would just, add there that obviously it's a minority of local authorities that have actually written in on this issue, and it should be noted that the Fife and South Lanarkshire submissions did say that overall the financial memorandum was a reasonable estimation of costs. They may have picked up on particular small issues, but they do broadly accept the financial memorandum, and as I said before, the agreement was made with COSLA as a representative body.
I think it might be helpful to the committee if we simply respond on the various issues raised by the local authorities by letter, so that we can reassure you on each and every one of the issues raised. Yeah, but I mean, but the point is that in some cases there are assumptions made that do not apply, and in other cases we can provide you with specific answers. So we would look to do that rather than not do so now.
Okay. Well, maybe just one final question. I mean, I accept the point that not every increase in cases will lead to additional costs. But I also just find it very difficult to accept that there will be no additional costs whatsoever by increasing. Some of them, no doubt, can be absorbed, but it's certainly the evidence we're hearing is that they certainly can't all be absorbed. I merely ask you to reflect on how you reach a conclusion that none of the additional cases at all will lead to any additional costs. I find that surprising, but I'll leave it there, Convener.
Happy to respond on that to ensure that the position is entirely clarified for you.
Thank you.
Okay, and you don't need to respond on the assumed cost of community sentences because it's in table 29 of the FM. Michael, to be followed by Malcolm.
Thanks very much, Convener. This is a short question. We've seen evidence this morning of some of the disparities between the figures you're using and the concerns of local authorities. But in their submission, Falkirk Council stated that because of those concerns, because of the wide margin of error, if you like, that appears to exist between the financial memorandum and the local authorities' assessments of the new legislation or the impact of the new legislation, they've said it would be preferable if the government gave an undertaking to review costs in future in the light of the experience, so that any marked increase could be funded. Could you give that commitment?
We'll certainly be monitoring the actual impact of the bill and maintaining communication with the key bodies. So, yeah, yes.
Okay, that's fine. Thanks, Convener.
I mean, I found this a very interesting financial memorandum. I mean, for two reasons. One, because it seemed that a lot of the debates about costings were so inextricably bound up with the fundamental controversies of the bill, corroboration being a good example. And so there's just an inherent uncertainty, but obviously you suspect that people are coming to their conclusion because of their position on the policy rather than anything else. But I mean, that's just a comment, but I'll certainly follow that with great interest. But the question I wanted to ask was more about opportunity cost, because that was the other thing I found quite intriguing about the financial memorandum, because I was struggling all the time to, I suppose, to wonder why you were using this term, because usually when you use the word opportunity cost, in my understanding, is you're doing something and there's a price to pay, because if the opportunity cost of a policy is all the things that you can't do through implementing that policy, but you seem to be using opportunity costs almost as code for efficiency savings. So I was a bit puzzled by the use of that particular word. I mean, you may want to comment on that, but I suppose the point about if it is fundamentally related to efficiency savings, then clearly that is being questioned. For example, by the Association of Scottish Police Superintendents. I won't read out their whole quote, but they're basically saying, well, look, we're already having to make lots of efficiency savings in order to free up resources that they refer to early retirement and voluntary retirement, for example. But I suppose what they're saying is with staffing reductions, then they have to make efficiency savings for that. So I suppose some people might have the suspicion that some of these big sums of money attached to opportunity costs are really slightly misleading, that really they should be called financial costs, because you can't have unending efficiency savings and just badge up all the additional costs, so they'll be dealt with by efficiencies.
Now I think I've explained what opportunity costs are already. There is an element of efficiency saving, but for example, for the police, we have 17,234 police officers who are carrying out their job one way just now, and if the bill is passed, will need to carry out their job a different way. And it's the frontline officers that the main costs on this will fall on. It's not. There will be instances where, in fact, some of the provisions of the bill do provide efficiencies in themselves. The Bowen provisions, for example, and everybody in government, centrally or locally, is being asked to look for efficiency savings, but that's not the core of opportunity cost as we're using it in this financial memorandum. There will be an expectation of bodies generally to be making efficiencies, but we're not necessarily offsetting new costs against efficiencies. A lot of these costs are not new, they're resources being used for something different.
Well, that may be more closely related to the normal meaning of opportunity cost, but it then leads to the question, what will not be done that is currently done? Because that's central to the concept of opportunity cost, is that there's some good activity that you can't do because you're now doing an alternative activity. That's really central to the whole concept. So, but that doesn't seem to be acknowledged in the kind of narrative around opportunity costs in the financial memorandum. So it's almost as if you're redefining language in a kind of slightly puzzling kind of way.
I jump in on, I mean, obviously we're talking about police costs as one of the largest areas where we're talking about these opportunity costs. And if I could just hone in really around paragraph 128 in the financial memorandum, which has 9.8 million of what we're classifying as the opportunity cost. So it's really the bulk of it for police. That almost entirely relates to training. And this is, I think, one of the key areas where perhaps the term opportunity cost, as you say, here we're not meaning substituting for something else. I think what we're saying is, because we've moved the implementation date away from 14-15, which was raised by police as a year where if they were to have to do all this additional training, there would need to be backfilling and overtime, which would carry a real financial cost. However, by moving it into 15-16, the indication was they would be able to move this training across the year in such a way that it would just take normal police time. There wouldn't be backfilling, there wouldn't be overtime. So to classify that as a financial cost would, I think, have been very misleading, because there wouldn't be a financial cost associated with it. It would be carried out in the course of normal police time. I think that was 8 million. There's another 1.2 million, which is training staff time for delivering training. Again, these are staff that are currently in post delivering training. And again, the discussion was around, if we move to 15-16, can this be kind of worked into the normal course of training for police without having to take on additional training staff, which again would carry a real financial cost. So I think if we look at that, I don't think arguably could have carried what would be known as a real financial cost. It was effectively being absorbed because we moved the implementation date without carrying an additional cost. I think, again, there's a similar argument around the prisons costs, as we've discussed, because there's the flexibility at the moment with the way the prisons are able to manage their portfolio, their estate, and move prisoners around. What they indicated to us was there wasn't a direct direct financial cost arising from the provisions of the bill. So I don't know if that
Well,
helps.
I mean, prisons is probably the best example because I think that's the highest sum of money
Yes.
of all. It's 22
Yes.
2 million as a result of increased prison places. It's just hard to imagine how you can have a lot more prisoners with no real cost. That's very hard to
Well, I think effectively here it comes down to the use of the average £37,000 per year for an average prisoner place. Now, this is where I think opportunity cost really comes into its own. If we put one more prisoner into the prison estate, that isn't necessarily going to cost £37,000 for that particular prisoner, because the £37,000 takes into account the cost of the estate, the depreciation of the estate, and putting one more prisoner in, you're not then going to have to build a new prison for that prisoner, if that makes sense. So I think we've used the £37,000 average, but that is an average across the estate of the cost of a prisoner. Putting an extra £200-300 in per year doesn't actually cost that per se. It actually costs just the amount it costs to feed that prisoner and the various direct costs attributable to putting that extra prisoner in the prison.
Well, I mean, even that is a financial cost rather than an opportunity cost, or you might assume that staffing levels were related to the number of prisoners in some way as well.
The indications that we've had from prisons is around that extra 200 odd. Those costs are already largely included in what's been put forward for the annual prison running costs. So the prison running costs, they have some flexibility for prisoner numbers going up and down on an annual basis, which is why we've seen in previous years prisons coming forward with underspends, for example, during the year, where running costs have actually been slightly lower than previously anticipated because prisoner numbers have been slightly lower. That happened last year, 12-13.
I mean, it may be that I've not done enough financial memorandums to know, but it seems an interesting concept to introduce into the world of financial memorandums, because you could use this concept for every financial memorandum, and you know what I mean? It's a kind of way of, it could be seen as, I'm not accusing you of this because I'd have to look into it more, but it could be used in any financial memorandum to disguise financial costs, because you could always use the kind of arguments that you're putting forward. Well, they're not real costs, they can all be absorbed, or they can all, you know what I mean? So
yeah, I completely see. I mean, I think that's why we've been very careful on these to agree them with our partners, because I think that partners have been very vocal where they do feel that there is an additional financial cost. And for police, again, as I outlined, there are specific areas where they've said, no, absolutely, this will result in additional financial costs, and these have been captured here. The same for Legal Aid Board. So I think that discussion, we wouldn't go ahead and call these opportunity costs if that hadn't been agreed beforehand with partners in question, because I think you're absolutely right. That could lead to us trying to badge everything as an opportunity cost, which I think would be misleading. But at the same time, had we have called many of these financial costs, I think that wouldn't have been transparent either, because, as I said, we're not going out and spending £10 million on training police officers. It will be part of their normal average training facilities in year.
okay, thank you.
Yes, well, supplementary, if I may, on what has just been asked. I mean, going back to paragraph 128 was mentioned, also 126, and it talks about staff time for attending 18 hours of training. So I don't know if that's every officer. But in 126 it says this can be achieved through reallocation of the officer from normal duties, in most cases without the need for overtime payments. So the extra time that Mr Chisholm is talking about is going to be included in their total normal hours. So that means that either they go to less training on first aid or equal opportunities or something like that, or they are less on the beat. Because I do not see the police in my area sitting around having long tea breaks. So have we done any digging as to what will the normal duties be that get cut out to do this extra work?
We have, I mean, it would be for the individual agencies to comment in detail on what precisely they would do and not do, but we have been having conversations about detailed implementation plans, and that is continuing, but it's slightly dependent on the final form of the bill itself and other factors, because we're talking about financial year 2015-16, so that's quite a long way in advance to be thinking about training and workload issues.
don't know that it is really, because it's all surely included in the FM and the forward financial projections, is it not?
Sorry, what precisely?
You were talking about it being quite far ahead, but surely we have to think about this if we're looking in terms of the financial memorandum at long-term cost implications.
Yeah, absolutely, but perhaps not at the exact detail of which training courses police officers will and won't be going to.
But if you're looking at the overall cost of that, then you have to surely do that. You have to know what you're actually going to be paying for in terms of, you know, the financial memorandum. And the
yeah,
bill.
no, sorry, I don't mean to suggest that we haven't modelled what training will be required for this bill, and that's what's set out, and that's why it's put forward as an opportunity cost. And that is exactly what needs to be balanced against other training priorities.
Right. Now, just want to go back to some of the beginning. I mean, some things that have not been covered as we've progressed through the session. Colleagues having asked, obviously, a number of questions. Total recurring costs and non-recurring costs. The total recurring costs are a very precise £6.587 million per annum, but non-recurring costs, I note, are £2.703 million and £1.648 million in 2015-16 and 16-17 respectively. Do you envisage any other further non-recurring costs, or do you think that it will all be resolved within 2 years, that the costs will be effectively zero after those 2 years?
The non-recurring costs you're referring to are primarily around police capital costs for additional interview rooms, and that is modelled on the basis of what they put to us as their plan for meeting the requirements of this bill. My understanding is that the position around police premises is a slightly more complicated picture now that they've moved to a single police form, and there's all sorts of rationalisation around that going on. But yeah, that's based on what they told us. And my understanding is within this change that's going on at the moment, there is actually a reasonable capacity in terms of costs being freed up from the rationalisation of the estate, and also, quite apart from what has been modelled here, there is work that's currently going on in terms of capital fund management within the police, in terms of building new facilities. So, in fact, I think that those costs are potentially manageable within that other work that's going on.
Okay, thank you for that. Now, one of the things referred to in the Faculty of Advocates submission was the estimate of costs attributable to additional appeals generated by the change in the law. They say that this doesn't seem to have been considered.
Yes, there's a cost quoted for the Crown Office, which they raised with us as a specific issue for their team, which deals with this, which had seen an increase in workload as a result of the 2010 Act, and they anticipated an increase for the workload of this specific team. This wasn't raised with us by any of the other agencies, so we felt that it was probably something specific to the work of that team, and that's why we haven't looked at it in other areas.
So you don't feel that there should be any cost reflected in the financial memorandum of that?
I mean, my understanding is that it's not a standard process in financial memoranda to say we're changing the law, therefore there will be more appeals. I don't think that's something that's applied to all financial memoranda of this type. It was simply because Crown Office raised a specific issue about this particular team, and were able to evidence it, that we felt it was worth reflecting in the financial memorandum.
Okay. Gavin wants to come in on this point. Gavin?
So it's a slightly separate point. That's good. All right, well, thank you. Just want to look at Table 3 of the financial memorandum. It's page 39 of the document I've got. I'm not sure if your numbering will be the same as that. But there's a heading there. It's just about the opportunity costs. For SPS, the opportunity costs for 15-16 are 6.85 million. For 16-17, they become 14.6 million. It then goes up to 18.65 million, and then it goes up to 22.75 million. My question is, do the opportunity costs for the SPS just continue along that trajectory over time? And if so, we'll take on board there's not a direct cost every time there's an extra prisoner. Surely if it's on that trajectory, at some point, these must become real financial costs, and you can't just class them as opportunity costs.
Yeah, I can see how that's slightly misleading in the table there. The figure for 2018-19 is the full impact of the bill, and we would anticipate it being at that level going onwards. The reason why it's staggered like that is because it's modelling prison sentences that might be several years long. So in the first year, you'd have additional cases, but in the second year, you'd have additional cases, but also continuing to serve the cases that were brought in the first year. So that's why it ramps up. But it ramps up to a particular level, and that's what we anticipate being the long-term level.
But what would you not have some prison sentences that were longer than 3 years? I mean, you're saying very correct. You're saying it gets to 22.75 million and it never goes higher than that. But what if some of the prison sentences are considerably longer than 3 years? Surely that figure then does go up.
Oh, that figure was done using an average prison sentence of I think 8 years. So therefore, it takes 4 years to reach the average level, because after the 4 years, you've got people starting to leave prison who had previously gone into prison as a result of it. So that's where our analysts suggested it would start to level out. Obviously, it's not an exact science, so there might be some variation there. But that's the picture that our analysts developed, certainly.
Right. Okay, Gavin, that was a kind of digression from what we were talking about, so apologies for that. To take you back to appeals, I mean, you were talking about the FM there. Surely if the legislation means there's an additional cost, then it should really be incurred within the FM, or it should at least be touched on in terms of appeals. You know, it's got to be, it's got to be funded somehow, hasn't it? I mean, if additional appeals are generated by a change in the law, surely there has to be a financial implication.
Yeah, I mean, I think our position there was that we didn't have sufficiently robust evidence to suggest that there would absolutely be an increase in appeals across the board. It was just that specifically this team within the Crown Office had raised a particular issue about their workload, and that's what we reflected. Okay, is that not something that should maybe be looked at then a wee bit further? We can have conversations with other agencies and get back to you if that would be helpful. Thank you very much. Just one other thing, it's about the shadow exercises. You know, the FM states that the Police Scotland and COPFS conducted shadow reporting and shadow marking exercises, as was touched on earlier in Jamie's questioning. But the Faculty of Advocates stated that the FM did not provide sufficient information on these exercises to allow for meaningful comment. But earlier on, you were talking about this being thorough and robust. But the Faculty of Advocates is saying, well, we can't even comment meaningfully on it because, in their view, it hasn't been robust and it hasn't been thorough. It's so how can we get accurate reflection of what this is going to impact on financially if that is indeed the case? I think that the exercise that was undertaken was absolutely robust and thorough. The description of it in the financial memorandum perhaps wasn't as detailed as it might have been, but I think that the additional information that has now been presented by Crown Office really gives a good picture of the thorough investigation that went into this. Okay, thank you. Well, I'd like to see if there's any further points you would like to make before we kind of wind up as a bill team. Anything else you would like to add just at the end here?
Thank you for such a very thorough scrutiny this morning. We will provide the other information that you've asked for that we couldn't answer off the cuff sitting here. But the financial memorandum before you does, in fact, represent a great deal of hard work with all the main bodies concerned, and they have all signed off on it. So it is an agreed position with the main bodies that are affected by this bill. Despite novel aspects, what we were intending to do at all times was to reveal to the committee as much relevant information as we could, together with our thinking as to why we reached the conclusions we did.
Okay, well, thank you very much for responding to our questions. We look forward to receiving further information in writing. Thank you. I'm now going to suspend for 5 minutes to allow a changeover of witnesses and give committee members a natural break. Thank you. Folks, we are almost exactly on schedule, and our final item of business is to take evidence from the Scottish Government Bill Team as part of our scrutiny of the Procurement Reform Scotland Bill's financial memorandum. I therefore welcome to the meeting Messrs Paul McNulty, Bill Watt and Neil Ramage, and I believe that one member of the team would like to make a brief opening statement.
Thank you, Convener. I'd just like to say a few words, please, just to set the financial memorandum in context, and also just correct a few misunderstandings in some of the written submissions you've received. In developing the content of the bill, we consulted very widely. It was always likely to be the case that the views of different stakeholder groups on this bill were in many respects going to be very different. The majority of the written submissions you've received appear to be from the procurement community, who were, of course, a very important stakeholder group. I would like to note, however, that some other groups have a very different view. For example, the ICI committee has been hearing from Jim and Margaret Cuthbert, who described the bill as extremely weak and clearly felt that it didn't go far enough. Some other civil society groups are also lobbying us, again, on the basis that the bill doesn't go far enough. So steering away through those opposing views has been quite a challenge during the process. And we've been very conscious of the need to avoid imposing unnecessary burdens on public bodies, and we believe that the bill that we've introduced does try and strike that appropriate balance. But this is also, it's really important that for this big amount of money that we spend, and the financial memorandum says over 9 billion per annum, we think it could be as high as 11 billion. So it's really important that the bill is effective in responding to business concerns about procurement, and in particular that it promotes a change in culture towards sustainability in its broader sense, helping us deliver better value from that spending. But the risk of imposing unnecessary burdens is one of the reasons why the bill is very flexible in terms of allowing public bodies to determine their own approach. A good example of that would be on community benefits. We're not saying you have to do something. What we're asking is that public bodies consider including community benefit clauses in higher value contracts, and if they don't think it's appropriate, then all they have to do is say so in the contract notice. On the thresholds for advertising, we looked internationally at what other European countries do, and what we're proposing at £50,000 for advertising contract opportunities is actually relatively high in comparison with other countries. And in fact, UK ministers are now out to consultation on a similar piece of legislation that is proposing contract adverts at a value of £10,000. So we work quite hard in Scotland to try and strike an appropriate balance and make sure that we pitch this at a level that is sensible. And a good example of the differing views is Dundee University, and one of the submissions you've received, questions on approach to the PQQ process, which is understandable. Yet in January this year, Dundee University's Construction Management Research Unit shared with us a paper that they'd prepared which suggests that the cost of the pre-qualification process to Scotland, just in the construction sector alone, could be as high as £1 billion. Now, we're not convinced that the problem is quite that bad, but what is clear is that there is a problem. Our discussions with businesses suggest that the PQQ process is widely inefficient, and getting a degree of consistency in how public bodies evaluate bidders is hugely important in reducing costs. On some of the written submissions, seem to have assumed things that we actually aren't intending in the bill. For example, there is a suggestion that we're promoting a one-size-fits-all for PQQs. We know that won't work because of the different types of things that are being bought. What we are proposing is that for the sort of questions that are typically asked for categories of contract, that public bodies actually use the core set of questions that we've been trying to promote for a number of years. And as part of the evidence base for the bill, we've looked at what public bodies are doing, and the vast majority are not currently complying with the core questions that we've agreed with purchasers and agreed with businesses. And tackling that is hugely important. There is also a suggestion that we're going to make HFE institutions uncompetitive. But in fact, we've been discussing with APUC and with Edinburgh University an exemption in the bill for contracts which are in pursuit of research and teaching commissions. And we've given APUC a written commitment that we will introduce such an exemption. It's not on the face of the bill because we'd intend to do it in the regulations that are provided for by the bill. And there's also been a suggestion that the rules might apply to call-offs under framework contracts that have already been competed. And in fact, the bill provides for a specific exclusion for that category of contract. So, in conclusion, we think the net cost, if we get this right, should be insignificant, because there is an opportunity here to make the procurement process substantially more efficient. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that opening statement. It was quite interesting to receive quite a number of submissions from local authorities and health boards, many of whom said they didn't expect any cost implications upon them, which is something which is very unusual for this committee, as I'm sure the previous bill team would certainly agree. As is a normal practice, obviously I'll ask some opening questions and then I'll open out the session to colleagues around the table. And the first one is really in relation to staffing costs for secondary legislation and guidance. The FM states that it is currently not clear whether these costs will continue beyond 2016-17 and no costs are therefore provided. But surely, you know, there should perhaps be some contingency in terms of that regard.
One of the reasons why we've suggested that there might not be a requirement beyond 2017 is that we have a procurement policy team already. We have a team of lawyers that work on procurement. So there is already existing capability that exists to support existing legislation and policy in this area. What is clear is that the bill is proposing new statutory guidance, new regulations on various aspects of procurement, and there will be a need for additional staff resource to support certainly the development of those regulations and that guidance. We think there is a possibility that there will be a need for additional central policy support, but at this point we're not clear whether or not the existing policy team might be able to manage once the new pieces of legislation and guidance have been developed and published.
So you're keeping it under review effectively?
Yes.
Thank you. Now, you'll be aware of the position of the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations in terms of their concerns regarding procurement capability assessments, which they've said are not useful for associations, and they've said that they have 170 member organisations, and overall they estimate that the cost of implementing the bill could amount to £50,000 a year, as they'll obviously have to have specialist staff to deal with that. Or a further £8.5 million in further costs, when obviously housing associations have a number of other burdens recently imposed on through welfare reform, etc. So I'm just wondering if you can tell us why housing associations should be included.
Well, the approach we've taken in the bill is to mirror the application of European public procurement directives to Scottish bodies. And registered social landlords, I think, are covered by virtue of a European Court of Justice case dating back to 2004. So for procurement purposes, they are regarded as public sector. Now, in terms of the additional costs, if you get this right, then our experience is that the procurement process, and there are exemptions, will be derogations from competition where competition isn't appropriate. So if there's only one potential provider, then you don't have to compete. But in our experience, actually, if you conduct procurement properly, the net savings should outweigh the costs. I suppose if they're claiming that in fact it will cost them substantially, I would question whether they have the resources in place to manage the procurement activity that they have. One thing we did note from the submission from the Federation was that typically the annual turnover of their members is only around about £5.5 million, which means that for some of the more advanced elements of the bill, like publication of procurement strategies, are unlikely to apply to a typical registered social landlord. It would just be the larger ones like GHA, for example, that would be covered by that provision in the bill.
So what you're basically saying is that A, European law is kind of impacting here, B, a lot of them it will provide a net gain financially, and see the you know, that they don't really have the volume to actually merit some of the procurement concerns that they've expressed, and perhaps they should be sharing staff and expertise across housing associations.
That would be one consideration. I think, you know, clearly they're already subject to European public procurement law for contracts at a value of £150,000 or thereabout and above, higher threshold for construction. All we're doing is introducing some new requirements that have got various thresholds attached. Advertising service contracts is at £50,000, construction contracts £2 million. So, you know, these are relatively large amounts of public, well, I suppose in their case they would argue not necessarily public, but for the purposes of procurement law, RSLs are regarded as public bodies. These are relatively large amounts of spending that we would suggest probably ought to have some process attached to them.
Okay, regardless of what I said initially, there are some local authorities who do actually have some concerns regarding a financial memorandum, and so we'll tease one of those out just now. Aberdeen City Council is one of those who say that additional administrative responsibilities are not reflected in the financial memorandum, and they talk about the impacts of lower thresholds on local authorities are greater than that upon the Scottish Government. There will be additional processes, training to be provided, and also additional staffing time in terms of addressing the implications of the bill, and I'm just wondering if you can talk us through that a bit.
Well, I think, you know, on a bill like this, we were probably never going to get kind of universal kind of agreement about what was the right approach. We've worked quite hard in engaging with stakeholders, including a range of local authority representatives. We've obviously engaged extensively with COSLA, and we believe that COSLA are relatively comfortable with what the bill that we've introduced, albeit they've made some specific requests in a submission to you around keeping this under review. And one of the reasons why we've opted for enabling powers in this area is that we're very conscious that we do need to make sure that we don't do something on procurement that has negative rather than positive effects. So it is in line with COSLA's request, our intention to keep this under review, and if what we've delivered actually does have the negative impacts that Aberdeen City and Shire have described, then ministers will have the flexibility to adapt their approach quite quickly, either in terms of changing the substance of what public bodies are being asked to do, or varying the thresholds at which they're asked to do it.
Within the submission, also Aberdeen City, I think, acknowledged that requirements are already competed, so there will be an element of process sitting behind that. What we're essentially doing is looking to enshrine good practice and legislation, so that will be about standardising those processes within individual organisations where appropriate, to make it simpler to do business with the public sector.
Okay. Sorry, I thought you were going to add something out. Mr. McNulty. Okay, just one final point I'm going to make, and then I'm going to open the session out to colleagues, which is from the Advanced Procurement for Universities and Colleges. In their submission, in paragraph 41, they say that it has potential to require highly bureaucratic activities and wide consultation for areas of annual expenditure that could be circa £13,000 to £15,000. To undertake resource-intensive impact assessments will be costly and could delay and compromise delivery of the actual need. So I'm just wondering, again, if you can comment on that.
Well, I think there is a particular concern in that sector because changes in the approach to funding universities in England means that they are likely, in fact almost certain, to come out of scope completely from procurement legislation. And this has long been a contentious area, a bit like RSLs. These are bodies that don't tend to regard themselves as typical public sector bodies. We can't do anything to help the sector in relation to application of European public procurement law because that was the subject of a European Court of Justice ruling some years ago in relation to Cambridge University. What we have undertaken to do is to help the sector by working with them, and this was confirmed by me to Advanced Procurement Universities and Colleges in September, that we will work with them to introduce an exemption covering research and teaching commissions. And I think that's one of their particular concerns, that if they have a degree of process that they have to go through before they can award a contract, yet the English institutions don't because of the changes to the funding model, then does that place them in an uncompetitive position when chasing commercial research and teaching commissions? So we've given them an undertaking that we will tackle that issue.
Okay, thank you very much for that response. In terms of colleagues asking questions, the first will be Jamie, to be followed by Michael.
Thank you, Convener. I want to turn our attention to Table 1 on page 15 of the financial memorandum, summary of Scottish Government expenditure across the 3 years set out. It says system costs will be £560,000 each year, and helpfully there's well, it's not a footnote but an explanation that these are essentially, this is money that's already spent. It can be soaked up into the existing, but it's not a new or additional cost. I think we'd call it an opportunity cost from our last exchange. I don't know if you were watching our last exchange, but maybe that's what you can call it. Okay, I'll bear that in mind, Convener. Anyway, I suppose we got the question, you know, what are the system costs? I see it's set out in paragraph 12 about publicising any one that's going to tender. They've got to publicise their intention to seek officers, the contract notice and the award of a contract or framework agreement, the award notice on the public contracts website. I just wanted to check, is there anything else that is a system cost, or is that it?
Well, we've got the system costs that are referred to here are principally in relation to two things: Public Contract Scotland, which is the contract advertising portal that would be the vehicle for advertising contract notices. That's provided for us by a third party, an Aberdeen-based SME called Millstream Associates, who I'm pleased to note have now got the contract to provide the Welsh Assembly's portal as well, which is a positive development. And also a thing called PCS Tender, which is our e-sourcing software, if you like, that allows bidders to respond electronically to tenders that are advertised on the portal. That's provided by a multinational company called Bravo Solutions, and would be the vehicle for delivering the database of PQQ questions, which is what we'll be asking public bodies to utilise to make it easier for bidders to complete their information when they're asked to submit a pre-qualification questionnaire. There are other system costs that aren't directly associated with the bill that are kind of far more substantial, that support an e-transactional system that is a shared service system used by just over 100 public bodies in Scotland, that is, this year will process over £5.5 billion worth of transactions. But that's not really included in the bill because it's not relevant to the provisions in the bill that we've introduced.
But I suppose the essential point is that that's an existing budget. You don't see
it's an existing budget.
There'll be no additional demand.
We don't think so. There is quite a competitive market for this type of system. The Bravo Solutions contracted for a period of time. We will need to recompete the contract that Millstream currently have because it's expired. But we're not expecting the cost to vary substantially because it's saying that it is a competitive market.
I want to turn to the issue that the convener raised about the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations perspective that it shouldn't be included in amongst the bodies that are subject to the provisions of the bill. And I was interested to hear you say essentially that it's European directors that sort of dictate this. I mean, so just for absolute clarity, if they weren't included in this bill, that would fall foul of EU law, would be breach of law?
They could be included or excluded.
Okay.
But what the government decided was the simplest path was simply to mirror the existing public procurement legislation, and that's proving relatively controversial, not least for RSLs, but also we're being lobbied around utility bodies such as Scottish Water. Now, the reason we took the approach was that it's an approach that's readily understood because we've had regulations implementing EU directives in Scotland since 2006 and at a UK level since the early 1990s. So we don't have to include or exclude anyone by virtue of EU law. It was simply a policy choice that we exercised around what would be the simplest approach for the bill.
Oh, okay. I mean, I think that's a helpful clarification. So, I mean, you've had an exchange with the convener, but just to explore it again, you I was about to say you dismiss, but I think that's probably putting it too strong. But you don't agree with the perspective of the SFHA that this will be burdensome for their members.
Well,
overly burdensome for
yeah,
members.
we're not that close to that particular sector, but what we would say is that it should only really be burdensome if there is limited process around the existing award of contracts. Now, we talked about local authorities. All 32 local authorities have procurement strategies. They all have standing orders that govern the award of contracts. What I would say is if there is a significant burden in this, it is likely to apply in areas where there isn't currently a procurement strategy or there isn't currently a significant degree of process around the award of contracts.
You talked about the requirements on housing associations being changed slightly as a consequence of the bill. Can you just talk a little bit more about that and how that might impact on them financially?
Yeah, I mean, there are various thresholds, and we gave a lot of thought to this precisely because of what would be appropriate in terms of whether or not there might be an additional burden. So, for the publication of procurement strategies, an authority would have to have in that financial year regulated procurements of a value of over £5 million. That means they would have to be awarding themselves, placing contracts, new contracts, at that value over the course of that financial year. So if a typical RSL's total turnover in any financial year is 5.5 million or thereabouts, and that would include staff costs, all the kind of costs that wouldn't come into the procurement category, then that would suggest that only a relatively small number of RSLs will be subject to that provision in the bill. Likewise, the provision on community benefit clauses has been pitched at a level of contracts of a value of £4 million and above. And some of the local authority representatives that gave evidence at the Local Government and Regeneration Committee last week suggested that, in fact, we might have pitched that figure too high. But clearly, if the sector typically has very low value contracts, then these provisions will not apply to it.
Okay, I mean, I hear what you're saying in terms of, it's not a sector, terribly. Presumably, dialogue is ongoing, though, and you're listening to concerns.
The Federation of Housing Associations was on our sounding board for the bill. Yeah.
That's reassuring. Just to change tack slightly, it was interesting to hear you say that you've given a commitment to advance the procurement for universities and colleges. About, I think I picked it up correctly, there's going to be an absolute exemption in terms of research-related procurement.
One of the key concerns that they've got is that a lot of their income derives from what they regard, rightly, as kind of commercial commissions. So in other words, if a private sector company is looking for a piece of research to be conducted, then universities will compete for that research. Clearly, there is a risk, particularly if English institutions are taken out of scope completely for any process relating to procurement, that they might be more fleet of foot in terms of pursuing those research commissions. So our proposal is to have a blanket exemption associated with the bill that will say that if you are awarding a contract that is in pursuit of a research or teaching commission, then the provisions of the bill will not apply to that contract.
Okay, I mean, that's interesting because the University of Edinburgh's concern was that the provision as was, it would they'd have to meet compliance obligations at a lower value threshold than would apply to institutions elsewhere in the UK. I'm not sure what the threshold is elsewhere in the UK, but I did hear you say that there's a consultation that it should be a £10,000 threshold.
UK government are out to
presumably
consultation
now,
on that.
We're actually in the position that's totally the other way around now, and they're actually at a comparative advantage given the commitment.
Well, what's different is if the English institutions are taken out of scope completely for public sector procurement rules, which is possible because of changes in funding, then the UK government's consultation on a 10k threshold might not apply to English institutions.
But I mean, obviously that's
it would be for them to determine. Yeah.
I mean, so okay. And one last question, if I may, convener, in the part 4 of the memorandum of remedies. it's set out that where a public body's in breach of its duties, the courts obviously can impose penalties, but you did state that such cases are rare, and as such there's no consequent expected additional costs. Can you quantify this for us, though? You know, when you say it's rare,
we don't have a central database, so it's difficult to quantify. It's kind of, you know, we think we know about most of the cases that result in a judgment, and typically, you know, it's in single figures in Scotland.
In what time frame?
In any given calendar or financial year.
Okay.
So there are relatively small numbers of cases that will go through the court process and result in a judgment. You do occasionally get quite difficult cases that are problematic for all concerned, but you know, part of the problem, part of the issue here, is that we needed to have measures that were going to be effective in terms of responding to business concerns, and in fact we were lobbied quite hard particularly from business and third sector representatives, to actually go much further than this in terms of creating a kind of a procurement ombudsman. And that's something that we've not kind of ruled out completely, but it's something that we will have to revisit anyway in the context of implementation of the new European Public Procurement Directive that we expect to be adopted early in 2014.
Okay. I mean, given that you're saying that itself as a procurement ombudsman seems a bit much, frankly.
Yeah. But there is quite a bit of appetite for it in parts of the business community and third sector.
Maybe someone's looking for a job, who knows. Just to quantify it then, I mean, it's obviously very difficult to say how many specific items are being procured or services are being procured in terms of the numbers, but you have helpfully said in the financial memorandum that the value is about £9 billion, and I noted that Mr McNulty said it could even be as high as £11 billion. So in terms of any given year, are you able to quantify the cost value of what's been procured that may have gone to court? If you can't give us it just now, then I understand it's quite a specific question. It may be helpful to have that in writing.
Yeah, we can tell you the value, because in Scotland, I think we were the first European country to do this across the public sector. We've created a thing called the Procurement Information Hub. That's basically an analysis of the outputs of the accounts payable systems of all 32 local authorities, all of the health boards, roughly 90% of the central government family, which is, as you probably know, the big core SG departments, agencies and NDPBs, and around about 90% in terms of value of spending for the HFE sector. There are some others in there as well, but the numbers aren't complete yet for 12-13, but we think that the 12-13 data will show that procurement spending in that financial year was in the region of between 9.7 and £10 billion.
So I think we're talking at cross purposes. The point I was making is in terms of those that went to court, what was the value of the procurement?
Right,
that's why I was saying if you couldn't tell me that.
I couldn't quantify that. And obviously some of these cases will concern contracts that aren't actually awarded, where there might be an estimated value attached, but there won't be an actual value.
Of course, okay.
We could have a look and...
Yeah, I think it'd be helpful. I mean, I'm fully aware I'm asking a question that is pretty detailed. You might not be able to answer it here and now, but it might be quite helpful.
And see what we can
that
provide.
Might sort of demonstrate, you know, how, well, not only how rare it is, but, you know, the value as well.
Okay.
So.
Thank you.
But thank you, that's been helpful.
Thank you. Michael, to be followed by Gavin.
Thank you. Let's cover some of the questions I wanted to ask in relation to the APUC, the University and Colleges submission. But in their submission, APUC pointed out that in relation to the consultation exercise, that they commented on significant financial resource impacts of the bill and how they would be incurred on contracting authorities. And we do not feel that our comments have been fully recognised in the current draft of the bill. Can you tell us whether that is after you gave the commitment to the exemption on R&D, or has this...
Well, what I would say is that the formal consultation produced 251 responses. Around about 200 of those responses were on behalf of representative bodies, or sorry, organisations is probably a better way to describe it. We had a hugely diverse range of opinions expressed to you, and it expressed to us it simply wasn't possible to accommodate everyone's desires. In fact, if you look at the kind of comments that we received from some other stakeholders, they clearly think we haven't gone far enough in the bill. I mentioned in my opening remarks Jim and Margaret Cuthbert, who, in evidence in the ICI committee, said they felt that the bill was extremely weak. So, you know, you've got these kind of very extreme kind of ranges of opinion here about what the bill should and shouldn't contain. So I'm sure that Angus Warren and APUC feel that way, but from our perspective, you know, we've tried very hard to steer the right path through these kind of differing views on the bill.
Yeah. But even if you accept that there are different views and not everyone's going to be satisfied with the outcome once those discussions have taken place, their follow-up position is that the assumptions of the accuracy of the financial memorandum, I think, would leave concerns regardless of whether that was accepted or not. Because what they say is that the assumptions in the bill's latest explanatory note state that there will be no financial impacts on contracting authorities, when in fact there will be significant negative impacts. Now, we've seen financial memorandums coming before us where there has been an assumption, people have challenged that assumption, but very seldom I think have I seen someone commenting that the disparity is between 0 and a huge impact. Can you explain that?
Well, that's their view. It's not a view that's shared by all of the respondents to your request for evidence. Colin Sinclair, who's the Chief Exec of NSS National Procurement for the NHS, was relatively comfortable with what we've proposed. COSLA believe that, you know, with certain important caveats, are relatively comfortable. So it is one view. It is not necessarily a...
Yeah, but if it's one view in relation to their specific area of expertise, then that has to be a concern, regardless of whether other people are comfortable, as the convener said, health boards, local authorities, some of them, you know, from their perspective, don't see the problems that APUC see. So, is there a way of addressing these concerns that the university sector have raised? Because I think when you see concerns being raised in this way, and to the extent that they've been raised, the financial memorandum to the bill is being challenged effectively in terms of its accuracy, and I think that's a concern that we should all have.
If I may, just to kind of scoot back to your earlier point for a second, it might be worth noting that both Aberdeenshire and Aberdeen City in their written submissions acknowledge, I think they say many areas which we have outlined would prove unnecessarily burdensome or costly if implemented have been reworked to make these more deliverable. Now, the elements of the bill will apply to Aberdeenshire and Aberdeen City Council in a similar way that it will apply to APUC and contracting authorities in the further and higher education sector, with exception to the earlier discussion about the exemption on research and teaching contracts.
Okay, thanks, Convener.
Thank you, Michael. Gavin, to be followed by Jean.
A couple of very brief ones. Table 1 of the financial memorandum, which is on page 15, which I think another member referred to earlier. There are three broad costs on there: system costs, staff costs and non-staff costs. According to the memorandum, system costs continue after 2016-17. Non-staff costs do not. But the middle one, staff costs, it's uncertain. I just wonder if you can expand upon that. What do you think is the most likely outcome for staff costs post-16-17?
I think a lot will depend on, as this kind of develops, on the extent to which there is an ongoing requirement to produce new guidelines or new regulations. There's clearly going to be an intensive period of developing this material once, you know, the bill becomes legislation. We will need to take a view in relation to the staff costs around about 2016-17 in terms of, is the job done in terms of rolling out the systems in the way that the systems need to be rolled out? That's one element of staff costs. Yeah, and is there an ongoing need for new and additional regulation and guidance in this area? That's why we've said that the staff costs are kind of relatively uncertain. System costs we know about, we expect them to kind of continue pretty much as is. The non-staff costs really relate to some adaptations that we'll need to make to existing guidance. We do have a range of guidance already made available for public bodies. We know that there will be a need for some non-staff costs associated with that, including provision of training and adaptation of existing systems. But that really we envisage being principally focused on this initial period of activity.
Okay. Very quick clarification on system costs. Am I right in, I couldn't be 100% sure from reading the table as a whole and the bits underneath it. The £560,000 a year, is that a new and additional cost?
No, it's not. We have existing contracts with two companies, a company called Millstream Associates that provides the Public Contract Scotland portal, and a multinational company called Bravo Solutions that provides the e-sourcing software that will support the provisions in the bill relating to pre-qualification processes. So these are derived from existing costs that are fully budgeted for within the Directorate.
Okay. So whether we had this bill or not, that cost
exists. Yeah.
Okay. Last issue then, it was really your opening remarks. You talked about PQQs and I think it was a piece of work you said the construction sector had carried out, who estimated that the cost to industry is in the region of £1 billion per annum. Is that roughly what you said?
It was Dundee University, and we can share the paper with the committee if that would help. It was Dundee University's Construction Management Research Unit published a paper in January, and they acknowledge in the paper that the data wasn't as reliable as it could have been.
Sure.
But they were raising concerns that the potential cost to the public sector and business in Scotland of the PQQ process could, in the construction sector alone, amount to around about £1 billion per annum. Now, we think, and I suspect the unit themselves think that that's probably an overestimate. But nonetheless, all of our engagement with business tells us that this is one of their #1 concerns about procurement, because public bodies typically ask very similar questions in different formats. And what it means is that companies have faced this continual churn of having to regurgitate the same information in slightly different ways. Now, what we want is to get this information captured in a central database. In order to do that, we have to have people using the standard core questions. Now, if the standard core questions aren't appropriate in a particular case, then clearly they will need to do something different. And some of the respondents to you have said, look, one size fits all doesn't work in this context. We agree with that, but we really have to get people adopting the core questions as far as possible to reduce this cost to business.
Sure. Let's just assume for the sake of argument it is £1 billion, and I take all your caveats on board. Ballpark figure, and I don't expect an exact one, but by what sort of percentage do you think that £1 billion figure could be cut as a consequence of this bill and follow-up secondary?
Difficult to give you any kind of precise feel for that. And as I say, we do think the £1 billion is a significant overestimate.
Perhaps helpful point, I think we did include an illustration in the financial memorandum. I think it's paragraph 91. Which relates to some of the information we received in relation to the cost of PQQ, and used one of those figures, which I think is the most conservative, which was the £1,000 figure quoted by SICA, and looked at management information from our systems over a 2-year period, number of contracts, number of expressions of interest, and for illustrative purposes that gave a figure of £75 million as an estimate that could potentially be saved to the business sector.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Gavin. John to be followed by Jean. Jean to be followed by Joan, I should say.
Thank you, Convener. I just wanted to raise, I think, some of the issues that have arisen in my experience over the last few years with procurement, and I'm pleased to read and hear your explanation of PQQ becoming simpler, because that's certainly been an issue. I wanted maybe just to go back before that to small companies actually getting into the portal, and some frustration around that. And I think you mentioned, I'm not sure what, Shoreline, who ran the portal?
Sorry, it's
the company that runs the portal?
Oh, Millstream Associates, yeah.
Right. Is there any, Are you comfortable about the process that's used for companies to have their name on the portal? And is there any appeals process for that if people are rejected? Who decides?
Yeah, there is no limitation on who can sign up, except that we only let companies register that have a legal right to register because they are based within Scotland, the rest of the UK, Europe, or one of the other countries like the US or Japan that have trade agreements with the UK and Europe that mean that their companies have a legal right of access. So if you aren't registered in one of those countries, you aren't allowed to register on Public Contract Scotland. That aside, there is no process of us sifting out companies and stopping them register. I believe there's some due diligence conducted by Millstream, so if someone registered using language that might be regarded as inappropriate or terms that might be inappropriate, then there would be some process around that. But Public Contract Scotland itself is not a mechanism for kind of vetting who can and can't apply for public contracts. It's free registration.
But that's a change.
Well, it's what happens in relation to Public Contract Scotland. You know, there are various ways that public bodies in the past and currently, you know, sift companies. And one of the things that we're looking to do in the bill is actually deal with some of the issues that have been raised by us, by business, where, in particular, there's been a lot of examples over the last few years of public bodies setting entry levels that we believe are completely inappropriate. For example, we've had a case where a particular public body in Scotland asked that a company bidding for its contract should have an annual turnover that was 20 times the value of the contract. And we think that's crazy. We intervened with the public body concerned. We got them to change the process, but we couldn't persuade them to reduce that turnover threshold below 12 times the contract value, which we believe is still completely inappropriate and damaging to SMEs. So there are elements of the bill that are clearly designed to help us tackle that type of issue and make sure that we have consistency of approach across the public sector in a way that will make it easier for SMEs to participate.
And you feel the bill will actually, can, in its present wording, deal with that?
Yes. Yes, there's a specific provision about annual turnover.
Okay.
Plus, we're seeking powers to make regulations on the selection of tenderers and to issue statutory guidance on the selection of tenderers so that we can cover a whole range of issues that have been brought to us by individual businesses and business representatives.
Staying on the same theme, really, I noticed that the bill's provisions are intended to encourage local action and to maximise public procurement's contributions to a wider socio-economic and environmental policy objectives. How will that be measured compared with the the bill?
Yeah, what we've done, I mean, because of the constraints of European procurement law, the point at which you can do most to help local firms and deliver local benefits is at what you might call the pre-procurement phase, the point at which you are deciding what it is you want to buy, basically. So we've focused very much on how public bodies address these issues in the context of their overarching strategy for procurement. In terms of how we might measure it, well, we expect the provisions of the bill to give us a lot more visibility about contracts, because there are provisions in there relating to contract registers. We will capture, the more contracts we can get through Public Contract Scotland, the better data we'll have, because we're able to interrogate Public Contract Scotland to understand who's been awarded contracts and who's receiving notices on contract opportunities. So there will be ways that we can measure what the impacts of the bill are. They won't be perfect, but there will, over time, be a body of data that the bill will generate that will tell us whether more or less contracts that are being advertised through Public Contract Scotland are going to, for example, Scottish registered companies or SMEs.
Okay. Do you think that the bill will allow larger contracts, or perhaps encourage those seeking delivering procurement to break down large contracts into much smaller bundles.
Well, that is pretty
I mean,
much what we're asking public bodies to do in the context of their procurement strategies. We're asking them to think about how they structure their requirements in a way that gives SMEs a better opportunity to compete. So yes, we think it should encourage people to think very carefully about how they structure their requirements. I mean, we do that for the contracts that we award. There is always, for the kind of collaborative contracts, a degree of evaluation of potential economic impact that would look at the Scottish landscape, for example. We don't always get it right, but it's a process we go through, and it's a process we think, you know, the wider public sector should adopt as well, because it's important. You know, we can't forget the need to pursue savings where they're necessary, but decisions to pursue savings through larger contracts, you know, have to be taken in an informed fashion and should only be done where it's necessary.
Is that the area where the Cuthberts might think that you haven't gone far enough?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. And again, we need to analyse what is best value. I mean, not necessarily, is that being ranked up or insisted on, or are there criteria used to identify what is best value versus lowest price?
Well, I mean, again, that's what we're trying to encourage, a kind of broader definition of best value, and that's what we're trying to encourage through the strategies, encouraging people to think about the kind of wider economic, environmental and social aspects of what they're doing. That is not necessarily something you can always build into a procurement process because of EU law, but you can do it up front at the point at which you decide what it is you want to buy and how you're going to buy it.
Focusing on the financial memorandum, no, not the wider policy aspects of the bill.
Okay. I'm sorry. That's fine. Thank you.
John?
Okay, thanks, Convener. Just maybe a couple of points, really. Going back to housing and the SFHA, it was mentioned earlier that you know, their average, I think, was about 1,800 houses, 5.5 million turnover, and you were suggesting that wouldn't be caught. They wouldn't be caught very much. I was just thinking, though, that if a housing association like that built 50 houses, that could easily be at 100,000 a time. That could easily be 5 million, even though the rent from that might just be a couple of 100,000. So, I mean, we can't really say by the size of their turnover whether they'd be caught or not. It would be the capital project that would be caught. Is that the case?
I would assume, I'd assume that the figures that we've been given by the Federation, that turnover would include capital spending in a particular year.
In paragraph 18 of SFHA's submission, I think they're going to say that the average association will procure possibly £2 to £3 million worth of repairs and maintenance work.
Yes, I was thinking more if they built new houses, that would take them over the limit, because that would not be included in turnover.
Project, yeah.
Yeah, okay, that's fine. And I mean, another point they made was just that they were kind of questioning the savings that they could make. I think that's in paragraph 12 of their letter. I think there's been figures from a previous study done that they could save 26 to 42 million of savings. I mean, could you just give us an idea of where you feel their savings could come about through this?
Well, I mean, in terms of, I mean, typically, if you kind of manage procurement processes correctly, then it's possible to drive savings out of them. That's what the public sector has done in general. I mean, I'm not close enough to the sector, and the procurement information hub that I described, we've worked with a couple of pilot projects with RSLs to look at some data, but we don't have a comprehensive picture of what the spending is in that sector.
So the suggestion is they may be spending too much at the moment? And
well, our experience is that by applying commercial disciplines to your procurement activity, it is possible to drive substantial savings from it. I mean, that's been our experience with the public procurement reform programme.
And would that mainly come through amalgamating, getting several housing associations or other organisations to work together?
If that's what they chose to do, and we've just published a review of construction procurement that suggests that some of the smaller public bodies engaged in this activity should do precisely that, to make sure they do have the right skills and resources in place to manage their procurement activity.
But if they join together and get a bigger contract effectively, does that mean that then squeezes out some of the smaller...
It might squeeze them into scope for some of the provisions of the bill, yes.
I was thinking if it squeezed out some of the smaller building companies that they then couldn't use because it was a bigger...
That would be a decision that they would have to take, and we're asking, as part of the strategy, for people to think about the impacts of what they're doing. So.
The other point, I think which was made earlier, is that Paul made a point earlier that most, if not all, bodies will already have policies in place, and I think, as I mentioned earlier, the bill for the most part is about trying to embed good practice and standardise those policies within and across organisations where appropriate, so that it's simpler to do business with the public sector. An example of that is a private sector body can go to Public Contract Scotland and look at opportunities across the public sector as opposed to having to search in various different locations for public sector contract opportunities.
Okay, and my final point was really back to universities and colleges. Just a couple of things they raised, and I wasn't sure if they were really valid concerns. I mean, they're concerned that their ability to short-lead would be reduced. And I wondered if you agreed with that. And they also felt that, like, for example, they might be offered better terms of payment, and they would, through this process, they'd have to end up with worse terms of payment. Is that?
Well, we don't kind of agree with that assessment. I mean, we think that some respondents to you have misunderstood what we're proposing on pre-qualification questionnaires, this whole question shortlisting. We're not proposing one size fits all. We know that doesn't work. We know that you will almost always need some bespoke questions, but there are a whole range of things that are pretty standard, like experience of similar contracts, accounts, a whole range of different things that actually everyone asks, but they just ask in different formats.
So they'd still be able to weed out a
still be able
lot
to
of
weed
the
out,
initial applicants, yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, that appears to have exhausted questions from the committee. I'm just wondering if there's any further points yourself and your team would like to make to the committee, Mr McNulty?
I don't think so, thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much for coming. It was very helpful. That being the last item on our agenda, I now close this meeting of the Finance Committee. Thank you.